Right, our second talk today is by Dr. Daphne Barker, who is a postdoctoral researcher working with Catherine Hopkins, Chris Black, and Richard Baker. Yeah, Catherine still has input.
She hasn't since
Not
she's
so much.
left.
Okay,
So I'm
right.
sure she'll
Mainly with Chris Black then. And you, Daphne's doing some interesting projects on this idea that noise exposure may be causing damage to your hearing, which we can't detect using our present clinical methods, but may be underlying a kind of epidemic of hearing loss, which we really don't know anything about. So it's quite an interesting study trying to detect whether there is this subclinical hearing loss, because it may have implications for the levels of noise that people are recommended to be exposed to. Is that a good summary, Daphne?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Would you like to explain it to us?
Thank you. So, as Chris said, I am working with Chris Black is now principal investigator. Richard Baker and Catherine Hopkins was the PI before she left in December. So, I've just come back from the ARA conference, the Association into Research in Otolaryngology, and hidden hearing loss, as it's called, was actually a very hot topic at the moment. So it's something that a lot of people are interested in, because hearing is not just the sounds that you can hear in silence. It's a lot more than just that, because there's not many times in daily life where you have to listen to a sound in absolute silence anyway. So there are current regulations in place that say anybody exposed to high levels of noise for long periods of time have to wear suitable hearing protection, such as earplugs or earbud and things like that. And they have to be monitored by a regular measurement of the pure tone audiogram. There are more than 2 million employees who are currently affected by the HSE regulations. So this is actually a very big problem. So as I said, hearing is not just the detection of sounds. So Kujawa and Lieberman in 2009 did an animal study that looked at long-term noise exposure underneath 85 dBSPL, so under the current guidelines. And they found that long-term noise exposure can cause up to a 50% reduction in synapses between inner hair cells and auditory nerve fibers. They also found a permanent reduction in wave 1 of the ABR that comes from the eighth nerve, without any permanent damage to the outer hair cells. So they had normal otoacoustic emission amplitudes and ABR thresholds. So as you can see here, this picture here on the left, so this is pre-exposure, and you can see the inner hair cells are nice and orderly, and there's lots of synaptic ribbons there. Just 1 day post-exposure, you've got disorderly inner hair cells, and the synaptic ribbons are very much decreased, so there's very few synaptic ribbons compared to how many there were before. And then you can see 2 weeks post-exposure here in the high-frequency region of the cochlea. There's high spiral ganglion cell density, whereas 6 to 4 weeks post-exposure, and there's no more exposure after that, but just based on this previous exposure, you can see cell death there in that same region. So Lin et al. Furthered this to say that there's a disproportionate reduction in the number of low spontaneous ray fibers following noise exposure, which could explain the reduction in wave 1 amplitude of the auditory brainstem response. So the high and medium spontaneous ray fibers are the ones that you're using mainly for the pure tone audiometric threshold. So they detect sounds in very low levels. However, when you get higher levels, these high spontaneous ray fibers are saturated. So things like listening to speech and noise, listening sound detection, any sound detection in noise, it's mostly your low spontaneous ray fibers that matter, or that you're using. So there's also been some human studies on this, looking at differences in discrimination between different noises. There's been also, as you can see, speech recognition has been shown to be significantly worse for noise-exposed listeners than matched controls. and significantly smaller ABR with 1 amplitude in tinnitus sufferers with normal audiometric thresholds. Now these tinnitus sufferers are not noise exposed, or they're not specifically noise exposed listeners, but many people who are noise exposed do also suffer from tinnitus. So our current research, we aim to determine whether these this occupational noise exposure at fairly high levels, but still underneath the agency recommendations, whether they cause changes to the peripheral auditory system that impact perception before the changes in audiometric thresholds are apparent. So before they're seen using the current clinical, sorry, I don't know why that keeps happening, current clinical procedures. And we also would like to characterise occupational noise-induced damage and provide the basis for a diagnostic test. So phase 1 testing was our psychophysical testing, where we're looking at cumulative noise exposure using questionnaires. So that gives us a cumulative lifetime noise exposure value. We're looking for the presence and severity of tinnitus using the tinnitus handicap inventory. Pure tone audiometric thresholds, outer hair cell function using the on and off frequency forward masking paradigm. Working memory scales, so that's just to make sure that our two groups are matched in terms of cognitive ability. Speech reception thresholds in steady and in modulated noise. Tone in noise, for 3 different frequencies, 500 Hz, 4 kHz and 8 kHz, and demographic factors. So here you can see this is the average audiogram for our non-exposed listeners in Apple and our exposed listeners in Blue, so there's no significant differences. We were only interested in looking at people who had normal audiometric thresholds anyway, so this is not really a surprise. The phase 1 results. So the first results I looked at was just like basically a big ANOVA, and we found that there was a significant difference in cognitive ability between the two groups. There's recently been a paper regarding the use of ANCA and factoring out covariates, suggesting that you can't just factor out something that might be strongly correlated with either the noise exposed or the exposed populations. So what we did is, this is just a, I think we've got about 40 in each group, so 40 noise exposed and 40 non-exposed. They're matched in terms of cognitive ability. So we have kind of factored that out by matching the controls. And still we find that there's no difference in noise emission ratings and no difference in audiometric thresholds. There's no difference in noise emission ratings because their noise emissions are lower than 85 dBSPL. So they may be up to 80, but they're lower than 85, so there's no significant difference based on what we're using. The most striking results that we found were in the speech reception thresholds. So the 6 talker, 6 talker speech-shaped noise is our steady noise, and the 1 talker speech-shaped noise is the modulated noise. I put them down as 6 talker and 1 talker because I can't just say that they're steady and modulated because they are speech-shaped. So you can see with these stars that all, I think actually I've got them the wrong way around, so I apologise for that. But the exposed, non-exposed individuals find it more difficult to detect the speech in the speech-shaped noise in both the steady and modulated noise. And there's also a bigger difference between steady and modulated noise in the noise-exposed than in the non-exposed individuals. And as I said before, this fits in with the previous animal research that says that it's low spontaneous rate fibres that are affected in noise exposure. So we were also looking at forward masking. This is not really a good result for us because this was meant to control for outer hair cell function. So we were not expecting to find significant differences between the two groups in the off-frequency, on-frequency, or the difference between the off and on-frequency forward maskers. So anybody who has any ideas what that could be with our normal audiometric thresholds would be happy to hear it at some point. So the next, phase 2, I'm just going to explain a little bit about transposed tones because very few people have worked with transposed tones before. So this is what we're going to use for our frequency following response, which I'll explain after this. So the transposed tone is a half-wave rectified, low-frequency sinusoid, and you multiply that by a high-frequency sinusoidal carrier. And what you're left with is this transposed tone, which is different to a sinusoid modulated tone, because it's got these kind of gaps in between. And what this does is it presents the high-frequency channels with the low-frequency information. So we're expecting that this gives us an idea of phase locking due to stimulus, which we're expecting to be impaired in noise-exposed individuals. So we're looking at ABRs, so just chirp ABRs, because apparently chirps are supposed to give a better wave 1 than just your normal tone bursts. So we're looking to see whether the effective frequency is dependent or independent of level for noise-exposed and non-noise-exposed individuals. We're expecting the effective frequency to be independent of level for the non-exposed, but to be dependent on level for the exposed listeners. We're also looking at frequency following response measurements, which is the sustained response to a stimulus in the ADR. So once you've got the onset response, then you get a sustained response in a longer stimulus, and sustained frequency following response is supposed to mimic the input. So the output of your ABR is supposed to look very much like the input. So 235 Hz tone would look like 235 Hz tone on the other side. And we expect there to be a difference in phase coherence between pure tones and transposed tones for noise-exposed and noise-damaged individuals, but not for non-noise-exposed individuals. There was an MSc experiment that was done on this. So our MSc student used 30 volunteers. So this wasn't occupational noise exposure, this was recreational noise exposure. But they all had normal pure tone audiometric thresholds and autoacoustic emissions. And mean age was 25 years, so they're all university students. And the main, main separator was whether they attended noisy events regularly or not, such as nightclubs. So he recorded the auditory brainstem response at 1495 dBSPL. So he was looking at tone pips because this was before we found out about the chirps, and blind labelling of waves 1 and 5. He also recorded the FFR for pure tones and transposed tones at 80 dBSPL. And what he found, so the pure tone FFR is a cross correlation between the 235 Hz pure tone and the frequency following response to pure tone. And we didn't find this to be there to be any significant differences, which is what we expected for that. However, for the transposed tone FFR, there was a reduction in phase coherence for noise-exposed listeners, but more than for the non-exposed listeners. So, like I say, that does suggest that their phase locking is impaired compared to the non-exposed. And this was just fairly young students, and their noise exposure probably won't have been very long term. So we're expecting similar things, but more striking possibly for older people who have been exposed for a long amount of time. So this top one, the FFR ratio, is the ratio between the cross correlation between the two measures that you just saw on the last slide. And we find that that's also significant, which we expected. But down here you can see that the high frequency average audiometric thresholds are, there's no significant difference between the two groups. So as I say, the issues with this, the MSc experiment was performed on young adults with recreational noise exposure. There were only 30 listeners in total, where we will have 60 for this one. Genders were not equally distributed between groups. Now we're only using, for our study, we're only using males between the ages of 18 and 45 years to try and control for any effects of age or gender, or to eliminate any effects of gender, certainly. So we're now looking for 20 listeners from each group from phase 1, so the non-exposed and the non-exposed with normal audiometric thresholds, plus an extra 20 listeners with mild high-frequency hearing loss, as you compare to the other groups. We're going to use chirp ADR as a function of level, so similar to the tone burst ADR, just with chirps. And then we're looking at FFR for pure tones and transposed tones, as I explained earlier, to see whether there is a deficit in face coherence. So I just wanted to say thank you to my co-investigators Chris Pack, Richard Baker and Catherine Hopkins, none of whom are here, and BAE Systems for providing me with the listeners. Thank you, Catherine.
Questions?
Your worker group in the first study, they're cognitively balanced. Is there much of an age difference between the two groups? Does that work out nicely balanced as well?
Yes, that works out nicely balanced. Yeah. So it's basically shipyard workers and office workers. Most of whom, I mean, this is in Barrow and Furness. So Barrow and Furness is quite a good place to study this kind of thing, because Barrow and Furness is basically BAE Systems, and BAE Systems is Barrow and Furness. So most of the people who live in Barrow work at BAE Systems and have done since they finished school. They do their apprenticeships and then they stay there for life, or so it seems. So yeah, they are quite well matched. They either work in the shipyard or in the offices, and there's no real differences between the two.
Okay.
Sorry, you mentioned that we're eliminating the possible effect of gender. I was just wondering, is there any reason to believe that there is a difference between males and females and how noise can do damage to the auditory system?
I don't know about damage. I think there is some research that suggests that female hormones such as estrogen do protect more from hearing damage. Is that right, Kevin? So I have seen some research on that. So that suggests that yes, there could be gender differences, and we don't really want to see that in our studies. So to eliminate them. Plus, I mean, it's not very difficult to find male workers. It would be incredibly difficult to find the female workers in the shipyard. So it's not really an issue for us anyway.
I was just wondering, thank you, Daphne, the MSc project you mentioned at the end, was there differences in the ABR between the two groups?
No difference in ABR.
So here's a question that might seem a bit strange. If we had mobile test facilities, would it help your study? Because you had lots of problems trying to recruit people.
Yes,
so if you had mobile facilities so you could drive around, would it have made it any easier for you?
I was reading that email this morning.
You already sent it? Oh. And what was your answer then?
Haven't received it yet.
Well, for this study, because we're testing on site, they've got a room for us to test in.
And we're all at the one place, so that made it easier.
Yeah, it's all in one place. So it just means me going up to Barrow and testing them. So I think for this study, not really, because everyone that I found in Manchester refused to take part anyway. I mean, people hear anything to do with regulations and they get scared. I think they think that you might want to change their health and safety, or tell them they're doing something wrong or report them to somebody. I think people are just scared in doing this kind of thing. So that was what our problem was. Once we found a big organisation who was happy to provide us with all of our listeners and a room to test them in, then everything was much better. So I don't think for this one it would have, sorry.
But if you were testing, I suppose, in a nightclub, was it MSc project?
Yes.
Was that student that came to a nightclub, they'll have to come here to be tested, or?
Yep.
You can imagine it might be hard.
Especially, certainly if you're looking for, say, temporary threshold shifts, then I think, yes, that would probably be very useful. Or for things like working with children, or with the elderly.
I didn't realise Mike had already sent the email, so I could have waited for the answer to come in.
But no, for this one, sorry, it's, I don't think we would have.
Mike.
But thanks, Daphne. Yeah, I was just wondering about the ad hair cell sort of finding that you got.
Yes.
So in my head, it just sort of makes sense that if you took a load of people with prolonged noise exposure, even if it was below the action level, if they've been just many years working in a shipyard, you might expect some sort of ad
But you'd
hair
also
cell
expect
dysfunction.
a difference in pure tonometric
Well,
thresholds.
that was my question. Was it just that they were below 20 on the audiogram, but
No.
Right.
No, in our sample there was no significant difference because we did check we specifically checked the difference at 4 kilohertz because that's where we expect the noise damage to be manifest to begin with. What I'm going to do is check for any differences at 8 kilohertz and see if maybe it's just a higher frequency difference than I expected. So yeah.
The Lieberman animal data from '84 shows that it's very hard to damage just inner hair cells without doing something to at least the first row of stereocenter of the outers. So, and I think there's some studies which show that DPs go down in some noise damaged individuals even with non-shifted thresholds. So you could be, just on the cusp of something. The other thing I thought about, one thing I thought about was something like detection efficiency, K. Which comes up in the auditory filter measurement, whether you can extract anything like that.
Yeah, well, we did do. We were looking at. We started off thinking about notch noise data, but then we changed it to tone and noise, just using the one notch. And so we had notch noise at 500. Tone and noise at 500 hertz, 4 kilohertz, and 8 kilohertz. And so as I say, this is just brand new data. I think for the 8 kilohertz it's approaching significance, but not for the other two. But it's not quite significant. There's no significant difference between the two groups on the tone and noise, which was our measure. Sounds your question?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I did try that. I did try something with detection efficiency years ago, but that was well above threshold, so I went down to something else.
Yeah, well, what we were going to do was change the notch widths. So look at different frequencies and different notch widths. But as it is, our testing is already 2 hours long, and we just didn't have time to fit it all in, unfortunately. So we just had to stick with the tone and noise.
Sorry, one other question. You say your two groups are average age 25.
No, that was for the
for the second
MSc.
Yeah, for MSc. Yeah. I've been doing a similar study, and I've asked people to fill in these self-report questionnaires. And whereas 19 to 21-year-olds, you can find people who are clearly not noise exposed, and others who are exposed. But when I got to, I'm sort of looking at slightly older, 25 to 34-year-olds, mean age about 28, 29. But the two groups just overlap, because if you go back through their history right back to teenagers, they've all got an exposure profile. Yeah. So are you seeing that in your data?
Absolutely, yeah. There's no significant differences between the two groups in cumulative lifetime noise exposure at all. So the as for things like social noise exposure and things like that, I think if anything, the office-based group seem to have more noise exposure, social noise exposure, than the shift workers. So we are specifically looking at long-term occupational noise exposure, because that does seem to be very well balanced between the two groups.
But if you tried doing an integrated cumulative exposure of their social noise exposure, it is quite phenomenal. If you take an average nightclub, minimum of 95, typically 100 to 105, depending on what you're going into, and you're into that for 2-3 hours at a time, and that's well over your weekly exposure.
Yeah, and we did take that into account. So with the with our noise exposure questionnaires, we had an occupational noise exposure questionnaire to begin with, and then we had a social noise lifetime social noise exposure questionnaire. So that's how much they went to nightclubs when they were younger, and how much they go to nightclubs in live music, live sport, any of this kind of thing, even DIY and things like that. So it goes through everything socially throughout their life. And then there's previous occupational noise exposure, because anybody who had noise exposure previously is unlikely to have had the kind of hearing protection that is nowadays offered, or indeed required. So yeah, there does, like I say, there was a wide range of social noise exposures in both groups, ranging from very, very little to thousands and thousands of units of noise exposure.
But can you still keep your two groups just reasonably separate even after that? Or, I mean, okay, you can separate them on the occupational, but don't they just start blurring? together when you take into account their total noise exposure?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. The two groups, in terms of total noise exposure, there's very little difference. So it's just the kind of the low-level noise exposure that's left over.
Right, you're looking at
Does that make
one.
sense?
Yes, okay, sorry, I'm thinking of a different one. You're looking at the problems of low-level chronic,
Yes.
as opposed to you get high-level acute.
No, we're looking at the low-level chronic. Sorry.
Okay. So it's a
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
subtlety.
So that's kind of what we want. We want the social noise exposures to overlap. We don't want there to be any difference really in social noise exposure, because then that could account for the differences rather than the occupational noise exposure. Okay.
You know, with the speech test that you did,
Yes.
what was your hypothesis? What did you think would happen with those speech tests?
Well, we expected we expected the noise exposed listeners to be much poorer in the modulated speech, or the one talker speech shaped noise, rather than the six talker speech shaped noise. And we are seeing that, but we are also seeing a significant difference in the steady noise, which we weren't necessarily expecting as much. But that goes with the low spontaneous rate fibre loss that was found in the animal studies, because your high and medium rate spontaneous rate fibres will be saturated. So if you have a deficit in the low spontaneous rate fibres, then you're unlikely to be able to perform the task as well as people who have more low spontaneous rate fibres.
So it's the people that were exposed that did worse, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my colours were the wrong way around, sorry.
Okay,
I
thanks.
noticed that just before I came down.
Okay, thanks very much, Daphne.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks all for coming today. I think next week's is Dr. Michael Stone. Do you know what your topic's going to be?
I did say on the list, yes. Well, hopefully, I'd like to encourage even sort of the audiological students as well. At first, it might sound like a dry subject. It's about factors that contribute to the masking of speech, and Daphne's just been talking about that, between whether you have a single talker or a continuous talker. And actually, some of the work that we've been doing, we've just finished in Cambridge, and there's a bit more we'd like to do here on what happens. And it's turned up some slightly surprising results, which has implications for the designs of hearing aids and hearing prostheses. So first, although you may think it's a slightly dry academic thing, it has some practical things which we want to try and emphasise as well.
You've convinced us. We'll be
bring your friends.